According to Wikipedia, the Korean government's official dictionary of Korean, called Urimalsum, has the second largest number of words of any dictionary of any language on Earth. Its 1.1 million entries puts it second only to the online Tamil dictionary Tsurkuvit. And it's a big number just on its own. I mean, I don't know 1.1 million words. We can move straight past the fact that counting dictionary entries isn't exactly a foolproof method for determining a language's active vocabulary size and ask, why Korean? How would Korean compare to any number of languages, besides Tamil, with an older literary tradition or maybe more speakers, have more words than all of them? I'm going to try to answer that question, and along the way give you way more information than you could possibly need about the history of Chinese characters in Korean. To start off with, Korean is similar to English and the other non-Chinese languages in the Sinosphere in that a significant chunk of its modern vocabulary is borrowed. Of course, in the case of Korean, just like for Japanese and Vietnamese, almost all of this borrowed vocabulary comes from Chinese. The Urimalsum Dictionary is published by the National Institute for the Korean Language, which is a government-run organization in South Korea. It counts 43% of every entry in the dictionary as being Hanja, or in other words, as having a Chinese origin. A full 60% of all technical vocabulary in the dictionary comes from Chinese. It seems that in Korean's past, Chinese filled a similar role to that of Latin in medieval English, as a source most significantly of nerd shit, like higher-level academic and literary vocabulary. However, the Sinosphere's languages differ from English in a pretty significant way. Most instances of borrowing between world languages take the form of an entire word passing from one language to another, with the word usually winding up with a slightly different pronunciation and meaning on the other side to match respectively the phonology and phonotactics of the receiving language, as well as the cultural context in which the word was received. So, for instance, English borrowed the verb joke from Latin jocari during the 17th century. For all their differences, Latin and English both have pretty unambiguous word boundaries, and the word was taken in whole. Here, the realization of the initial consonant probably shifted to ja from ya shortly after it was borrowed to match English speakers' usual pronunciation of the letter J, and the Latin infinitive ending was also dropped. And this is a pretty bog-standard example as loanwords go. But believe it or not, Korean's Hanja don't come from Latin. Instead, maybe unfortunately for Korean learners, they come from Chinese, which is an unusual language in a lot of respects. In particular, word is kind of an ambiguous term when applied to Chinese, and it's often used inconsistently, because most single characters or syllables can either appear on their own or in a group. So let's be clear here. Modern Chinese speakers distinguish two concepts. Tsu, read in Korean as ja, which always refers to a single character or unit of meaning, and which I'll just call character from now on, versus Tsi, read in Korean as sa, which refers to a group of characters, including a group of size 1, that is a defined meaning beyond just the sum of its parts. This is what I'll be calling a word in Chinese from now on. So for example, the word jintian is a single ti, which is made up of two zi, or characters. The first character, jin, means now, and the second, tian, means heaven or sky. You probably wouldn't guess just from knowing the meanings of the individual characters that the whole word means today. Modern Chinese speakers learn jintian as a unit, but that doesn't prevent the individual characters that make it up from appearing on their own as words in different contexts, or from being parts of other words. Some characters, like the plural marker men, never appear on their own in modern Mandarin. If you read Middle Chinese, you'll see a lot of multi-character noun phrases, such as dai biang, which means great peace. Here, dai, the first character, means great, and it acts to modify biang, which means peace. These sort of skirt the line between phrases and words, and while they became the ultimate origin of many modern bisyllabic Chinese words through standardization, they're still usually analyzed as separable multi-word phrases. These will become pretty important later on. So with all that in mind, we can say that Middle Chinese had very few multisyllabic words. I've seen one analysis put the total multisyllabic proportion of Middle Chinese vocabulary at less than 3%. And this specifically was the version of Chinese from which Korean, and Vietnamese, and initially Japanese borrowed the lion's share of their Chinese vocabulary. So now we're ready to look at how that borrowing took place. Korean has borrowed vocabulary from Chinese for as long as the two languages have been in contact, but it started in earnest around the Middle Shilla period, around the 6th and 7th centuries CE. Most Hanja, or Chinese characters, were taken in from between then and the 9th century, and then Chinese influence on the Korean pronunciations was frozen. So thus, the modern Korean pronunciations of Hanja are based off the prestige Chang'an, the literary readings, of late Middle Chinese during the Tang Dynasty, but spoken with a heavy Old Korean accent and also with 1,200 years of sound change on the Korean side. Just like in Chinese, the Koreans read every character with exactly one syllable. And I said Shilla Kingdom earlier. Shilla was one of the 3 kingdoms of early Korean history and the first state to unify the Korean peninsula, which it did in 668 CE. The modern system of reading Hanja is based off the Shilla Kingdom readings, but it was the last of the 3 kingdoms to come into full cultural contact with China. This means that it's likely that the other states on the peninsula, primarily Goguryeo and Baekje, which are each famous for being another 3 kingdom, have their own earlier methods of reading the Hanja in their particular dialects of Old Korean that have since been lost. These probably influenced Shilla's readings, though, because, due to its location in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, most of Shilla's early cultural and literary contact with China went through one of these other kingdoms. So now Korean has all these Chinese characters and their corresponding syllables floating around. At this point, which is earlier on in the written history of Korean, their usage kind of paralleled Middle Chinese in that each character mostly appeared either individually as a word on its own, or in a 2-character phrase that would be grammatically correct in Chinese. These 2-character phrases acted more like words in Korean and were generally structured with a modifying character coming before a base character like we saw with great peace earlier. You can think of them as an adjective followed by a noun if that floats your boat. Most Korean texts we have from the Old Korean period are written in a writing system called Idu. Many Idu texts are directly translated from a classical Chinese original, so they tend to consist of the original Chinese text, which is read using the Sino-Korean readings that are in development at this point, interspersed with other Chinese characters that are being used to write actual Korean. These include some that phonetically represent a native Korean grammatical marker, verb, or whatever, as well as characters that are being used only for their meaning and that are read with a completely native Korean word. For example, here's the last line of the Anminga, an 8th century Korean poem written in Idu script. I'm reading it with its approximate, reconstructed Old Korean pronunciation. Nalak Taibyeng Hamsta. So breaking that down, the first character is read in modern Korean as guk, and it means country. Here it's being used for its hun, or meaning, so you read it with a native Korean word for country, nara, or nalak in Old Korean. The second character is read as ak in modern Korean, and it means evil. It's being used phonetically, but only to show that the previous character is given its native reading that ends in ak. The next 2 characters mean great peace, and would be read taepyeong in modern Korean. They're being given Sino-Korean pronunciations and Chinese meanings, and this can be considered a loanword or loan phrase. The final 4 characters would be read han, chil, yo in modern Korean, and are being used to phonetically construct the Old Korean verb hamsta, which would mean something like should do, by picking certain sounds from their phonetic Sino-Korean readings. The last character, ya, has never been pronounced anything even close to the verbal ending da, which it represents, but its meaning in Chinese is something like similar or analogous or like, and the Old Korean verb for to be similar started with a da. The whole sentence translates to something like, the country will deservedly be greatly peaceful, or more literally, the country should do great peace. You can tell this is already a pretty developed system even by the 8th century by how finicky and complicated it can be. It's definitely in the championship for needlessly complex writing system with modern Japanese, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and, I don't know, whatever the aliens had going on in Arrival with the magic circles that let you travel through time. And speaking of Japanese, if you're at all familiar with its writing systems, you might notice similarities between Idu and how the kanji are read. Sometimes a kanji is given a native Japanese reading based off its meaning, and sometimes it's used to represent a syllable of Sino-Japanese. This isn't a coincidence. The development of writing in Japan seems to have been kick-started by an influx of scholars from the Korean kingdom of Baekje starting in the 5th century, and cultural contact between Japan and Korea remained pretty strong over the next few hundred years as both countries simultaneously desperately tried to figure out how to write their languages using Chinese. We've been talking a lot about writing Korean. Let's take a break for a second and kind of zoom out. Then, just like now, Korean was spoken more than it was written. We can talk about how Korean borrowed Chinese characters to write its language, but borrowed Chinese words or syllables took longer to actually enter the language as used. There weren't a whole lot of microphones lying around in the first millennium, at least not in Korea, so we don't have direct evidence for what vocabulary people were using when they spoke. But we do have some indirect evidence. There's a class of Old Korean poems called Hanja, which are almost exclusively written in Chinese characters used to transcribe native Korean vocabulary phonetically-ish. They're original poems, not translations, and probably more closely represent the language that was spoken at the time, at least by the upper classes. They start to acquire Chinese characters that are meant to be read in Sino-Korean with their borrowed Chinese meanings around the middle of the 8th century. The earliest example I could find was from the 760s, but don't take that as gospel. Another good source is place names. Almost all modern place names on the Korean peninsula are Hanja. This uniformity is because King Yeongdeok of Shilla ordered them all standardized by royal decree in 757 CE. Frequently, this was done by translating each Korean word or element in the place name to a Hanja with a corresponding meaning. I'm sure that not all of the new place names would have caught on immediately, but it does give us a clear, well-dated legal break, which is always nice to have. Interestingly, one of the few exceptions to the Hanja-based place name trend is the capital, Seoul, whose name is completely native Korean, although the city has had several different Hanja-based names in the past. So all that's to say that the Chinesening of Korean's vocabulary, not just its literature, probably really got started somewhere in the vicinity of 760 CE. And you'll notice I put so many qualifiers on that sentence that no one can tell me I'm wrong. Now we could go back into the weeds and talk more about the other ways Chinese characters were used to write Old Korean, and I'd love to do that someday, but I've said Old Korean enough for one video. Let's finally start moving forward through time. The start of the Middle Korean period is conventionally dated to 935 CE, the date of the fall of Shilla to the Goryeo Kingdom, which would rule the Korean peninsula for the next few hundred years. In 958, King Gwangjong of Goryeo instituted a Chinese-style civil service examination with a focus on Chinese literature, which overnight turned the entire upper class into ultra-weebs for China. From this point on, the share of Chinese-derived vocabulary would steadily grow to the level it's at today. By later Middle Korean, the 15th century onward, there were definitely genuine multi-character Hanja words in use in Korean, all of which were nouns or adjectives. We can see Hanja nouns begin to take native Korean case-marking suffixes like any other noun. Pretty much all the Hanja-based vocabulary coming in during the Middle Korean period was coined in China. Most of these words came in as phrases found in Chinese works of literature, but there was also a large class of two-character words borrowed from contemporary, especially Ming Dynasty, China. To reiterate, for borrowing like this, the identities and meanings of the characters was what was borrowed. The Korean pronunciation of the word was almost always based off the frozen, traditional Korean pronunciation of the characters used to write it, not the contemporary Chinese pronunciation. There are some words where at the time of pronunciation more in line with contemporary Mandarin was popular, but most of those have since been replaced in the interest of prescriptivism with the correct Hanja pronunciation, or else they're no longer considered Hanja. I'll give an example for the use of Hanja vocabulary in Middle Korean by quoting from possibly the most famous Korean text of all time, the Hunminjeongeum. The Hunminjeongeum was a guidebook written by King Sejong the Great of the Joseon dynasty to introduce his new writing system, Hangul. The Joseon dynasty was established after a relatively bloodless series of coups by a military general in the 14th century, and it'd rule Korea until the coming of the Japanese in the 20th. By the time Sejong the not great quite yet took over, the Joseon kings had decided that Confucius was way cooler than the Buddha, and Buddhists were all pretty dumb and stupid. A good Confucian ruler is supposed to see to the welfare of his people like a father would to his children, and so Sejong started casting about for ways to improve his people's lives. He decided that it'd be a good start to get all of them to be able to read, and by 1443 he and his scholars had invented Hangul, a featural, fully phonetic alphabet for the Korean language. I don't want to get too far off track again, and there are plenty of excellent resources floating around on the history of Hangul, but suffice to say it was a huge innovation and probably the thing most likely to instill a warm, patriotic glow into the heart of every true-blooded Korean. I have personally heard a Korean complain about the idea of English taking over as a world language. He said he didn't care about losing the Korean language, he was just worried that Hangul would be lost. As a side note, Hangul is super useful for linguists studying Korean because it means, for the first time in Korean's written history, we actually know for sure what things sounded like. Up until now, to reconstruct pronunciations of Old Korean and contemporary Chinese, we've been relying on cross-referencing different languages' modern pronunciations of the characters, along with medieval Chinese rhyme dictionaries and often unclear descriptions of consonants along the lines of first-grade, clear, muddy lip sound. Because of this, a lot of what we know about the Old Korean readings of Chinese characters comes out of working backwards from Middle Korean. Anyway, Sejong the Great published the Hunminjeongeum in 1446 to tell his people how to use a brand new alphabet. He originally wrote it, sort of ironically, in classical Chinese, but it was later translated to Korean written in a mixed Hanja Hangul script. I'll read the first 3 lines and then break it down for you. Naras malsumi, tunguigui dara, 문자와로 서로소 모스디 아니 허사이 The first line, naras malsumi, would be literally rendered, awkwardly, into modern Korean as narat malsumi. Nara is country or nation, malsum means speech. They're both completely native Korean words. In fact, we saw nara earlier as narak in Old Korean. The e suffix marks a subject here, so the speech of the nation. Then the second line, chung-gui-gui dara, would be directly rendered in modern Korean as chung-guk-e dala, although it would be grammatically correct now to say chung-guk-wa dala. Chung-guk means China, the Hanja literally mean middle country, and you can see the two syllables there written in Chinese characters with Hangul subtext to clarify their pronunciations for people who don't know them. The e suffix on Chung-guk, which is pronounced ui in Middle Korean, here makes it an indirect object. Dala is a form of the verb darida, to be different. Altogether, we can translate is different from China's, so the third line, Munchawaro soroso mosti ani hosai, directly rendering each element in modern Korean, Munchawaro soroso machianasho. Again, not exactly grammatical, but the less I have to pronounce Middle Korean tones, the better. Munja means characters or writing, and again you can see it written in Hanja characters with Hangul subtext. The rest of the sentence is in Hangul. Waro as a suffix means something along the lines of in relation to. Soroso is one another, and machianasho is an archaic way to negate the verb mata, to match or to fit. The subject here is implied to be the same as in the first line. Thus we can translate the entire sentence. The nation's speech is different from China's, so its speech doesn't fit the writing. This translation into mixed Hangul was probably aimed at less well-educated Koreans, so it makes relatively light use of Hanja vocabulary. More technical works from the same period are full of it, though. You can still see how it's worked its way into becoming an organic part of Korean sentences, and the amount of Hanja used in Korean text will continue to grow over the next few centuries. Let's take a closer look at how Korean is written from this point on. A lot of people are under the impression that once King Sejong invented Hangul, it became the only way of writing Korean until the present day. In fact, the Edo system of using purely Chinese characters to write Korean that we saw earlier, it stayed in use among the upper classes until the late 19th century. Hangul was actually off and on suppressed by kings who reigned during the 16th century after Sejong. A lot of court officials saw it as a threat to the central government and the natural order. Its usage survived among the lower classes and among women who usually didn't have any other options for literacy. The government eased its restrictions on the use of Hangul from the 17th century, but didn't start publishing official documents in it, documents that people could read, until 1894. But even when people did write in Hangul, a lot of it was in what's called mixed script, or Gukhanmun Honyong, where Hanja words would be written in Hanja characters, everything else written in Hangul, just like we saw in the Hunmin Jeongeum. Again, there are strong similarities to Japanese here. This mixed script became the primary method for writing Korean after its independence from Japan in 1945 and remained a common method of writing absolutely everything until the 1960s when, in a surprising twist, the teaching of Hanja was temporarily banned in South Korea. It's banned in North Korea right now, in fact. In the South nowadays, you can still find limited circulation newspapers written in mixed script, and some common individual characters are often used as shorthand for country names in more general news media. Or as personal names. The current president of South Korea is named Yoon Suk-yeol, but his name is usually indicated in headlines just by using the Hanja character for Yoon, his surname. But mostly the usage of written Hanja characters themselves has died out. Hanja-based vocabulary is still going strong, though. Going into the late 16th century, a new type of vocabulary began to be sometimes seen in Korean sentences, the non-Chinese Sino-Korean word. These are words that, instead of being coined in China and transferred to Korean, are created out of the whole cloth of Hanja characters. And this is the main point I'm trying to make with this whole video, and this is the difference between the relationships of Chinese to Korean and Latin to English. When Korean and Japanese borrowed the Hanja and the kanji, they weren't just borrowing words, they were borrowing an entire system, which they use even today to extend their vocabulary and coin completely new words. My impression from reading about this process is that it took some exposure to the West, to a civilizational center of gravity that wasn't China, to get the ball rolling. During the 17th and 18th centuries, while Korea was still very isolationist, newly coined vocabulary was present in very limited quantities. This includes a lot of words that would sound archaic or not be understood by modern Korean speakers, like injong, meaning bribe, or bangsong, meaning setting free. Nowadays, it just means broadcast. None of these combinations existed at all in Chinese, at least not with those meanings, and were unique to period Korean. But I have to emphasize, until the modern period, the vast majority of Sino-Korean vocabulary being introduced was still words that were coined, either in ancient or more contemporary times, within China. But now, starting in the middle of the 19th century, and especially going into the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Korean started to absorb a massive number of these non-Chinese Sino-Korean words in reaction to the huge changes in worldview, society, education, and technology that were sweeping through late Joseon Dynasty Korea. Words like munmyeong, civilization, sahue, society, gwahak, science, and eguk, patriotism. A few of those words I just mentioned were originally coined with kanji in Japan, and the Koreans adopted them into their own language by reading them with the Korean pronunciations of the Hanja. During this period, a number of Hanja characters came into use as common affixes that could be used to derive longer Sino-Korean words. These include the suffix juk, which means target or objective in Chinese, but which is added in modern Korean to convert a noun into an adjective, or jui, which, like the suffix ism in English, designates an ideology. This process of word generation with Hanja continues to this day. In 2023, Uri Malsum added 500 new words, including brand new Korean-coined Hanja words like balyagyan, meaning pet dog. This list of added words, which includes outlet, also reflects English's increasing influence on Korean. I'll illustrate the status of Hanja in modern Korean with an example. This is the first line from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in modern Korean. 모든 인류 구성원의 전부의 존엄성과 동등하고 양도할 수 없는 권리를 인정하는 것이 세계의 자유, 정의 및 평화의 기초이며. If you replace all the Sino-Korean words there with Hanja characters, you can see how overwhelmingly Sino-Korean the sentence is. If you count as generously as possible for native Korean vocabulary, it still makes up less than a third of that sentence. But a number of the Sino-Korean words have no counterpart in Chinese. They're created outside of China using the Chinese system. That's written in pretty high-level language, so it uses proportionally more Sino-Korean vocabulary than average, but I can use it to demonstrate some important facts. First of all, almost every Sino-Korean word there is 2 or 3 characters. There are some exceptions in modern Korean, but for the most part this is universally true. The few Sino-Korean words left that are a single syllable or a single character tend to be fairly low-level or common. The one in this example, su, normally means hand, but in Korean has developed a role as a particle in a common verbal construction. 할 수 있다 meaning to be able to, or 할 수 없다 meaning to be unable to. Other common single Hanja words are se, meaning age is a more honorific counterpart to the native Korean word sal, nyeon meaning year, and sek meaning color. Another large class of exceptions are the numbers, but I'll talk about Sino-Korean numbers in a bit. The second thing you'll notice is that every Sino-Korean word there is a noun. This is also universally true. Korean, as a rule, does not borrow new verbs. Linguists would call Korean verbs a closed class. However, to create a verb phrase, which are often just referred to as verbs anyway, you can take a Sino-Korean noun and put it in front of a verb, usually hada in the active and dueta in the passive. And you can see that happening in the sentence. 동등 is equality. 동등하다, here conjugated as 동등하고, means to be equal. 양도 means relinquishing or alienation. 양도하다, here is part of that verbal construction I was talking about. 양도할 수 없다 means to alienate. Now numbers. Korean actually has 2 sets of numbers, one native Korean and one Sino-Korean. I'm getting tired of saying this, but just like Japanese. Similarly to Chinese and many other East Asian languages, Korean frequently uses counters with numbers. You don't say one woman, you say one human of woman. 여자 한 명. 여자 means woman, han means one, and myung is the counter for people. The 2 numeral systems exist in parallel, with Sino-Korean being used frequently for numbers above 10 and almost exclusively for numbers beyond 100. Certain counters can only take Sino-Korean numbers. I mentioned the existence of 2 counters for age earlier, the Sino-Korean se and the native sal. Se is more formal and it's usually used in writing or to refer to the elderly. If you're using se, you give the age in Sino-Korean numerals, 28, 28 years old. If you're using sal, you give the age in native Korean numerals, 28살, same meaning. Some counters are stranger. If you're giving the time, then the hour is native Korean and the minutes and seconds are Sino. 3시 33분 is 3:33. So this gives us one answer to the question of why does Korean have so many dang words? It's parallel vocabularies. Due to its history, Korean has multiple words for a lot of concepts, one native in sun urimal as the Koreans would say, and one in Hanja. English has turn and revolve, Korean has dolda, native, and 회전하다, Sino-Korean with a native Korean verb. English has house and maybe home, Korean has cheap, native, jutek, Sino-Korean, and kauk, also Sino-Korean. Off the top of my head, I can't think of another language that has this level of parallel vocabularies going on. Maybe Japanese. English definitely has it to a degree, but to me it seems that Korean's on a whole different level. That last example with house brings us to a theory I have, a second reason for Korean's huge vocabulary size. Because I lied to you there. Korean doesn't just have cheap jutek and kauk. It also has goju, which is more along the lines of residence, and you can add the locative suffix ji, gojuji, for place of residence. And it has gajong, which is usually translated as home. Korean doesn't just have wonchik for principle. It also has woli, which is more along the lines of underlying or basic principle, and jui, which is more like a principle of belief. We saw that one used as a suffix for deriving ideologies earlier. Jongchek means policy, but so do bangchim and bangchek, each with subtly different shades of meaning. And there are differences in meaning. You wouldn't usually use jutek and gajong in the same context, just like you wouldn't use house and home in exactly the same way in English. So, my theory goes that Korean has more active vocabulary, in part because there's less mental overhead involved in remembering so much of it. If you study the Hanja in school and spend your life using Hanja-based words, then you naturally start to associate certain meanings and concepts with certain syllables, even if you got a 0 on your Hanja final in high school. Koreans I've talked to have said that they can usually use context and a vague knowledge of Hanja syllables to interpret new Sino-Korean words that they see, even if they've never seen them before in their entire lives. The Korean media use a single word, sanyuguk, to mean oil-producing country. And that's a real word that appears in the dictionary. It's built out of the Hanja for production, oil, and country. You can't do that sort of thing in English. And what's crazy is that when I first encountered the word, I knew exactly what it meant because I'd already seen each of those characters in different contexts. And I don't even speak Korean very well. And what I'm saying isn't completely guesswork either. There's literature that supports the idea that in Korean, a strong foundation of Hanja increases the rate at which native speakers learn new vocabulary. And I also have a study that found that among second language English learners, a knowledge of English derivational processes has a strong effect on the learner's lexical breadth, or the number of words that they understand. And of course, these probably aren't the only factors. Both Koreas have, thanks to Hangul, a very deep tradition of literacy across the socioeconomic spectrum, and currently have some of the highest reported literacy rates on Earth. South Korea has a particularly strong educational system and some of the highest rates of tertiary educational attainment in the world, which is the proportion of the population that's graduated college. Maybe unsurprisingly, both literacy and educational attainment are strongly linked to adults' active vocabulary size, at least in English, and I have a hard time believing that this doesn't apply to Korean as well. So, I think that those are the reasons for why the Korean language has an unusually large vocabulary. But even if I haven't convinced you, I still hope you learned something else interesting today. Or if you're still grumbling about how counting how many words a language has barely makes any sense and comparing dictionary sizes is stupid, then don't worry. On a deep philosophical level, I actually agree with you, and this whole video is a simple ruse to give me an excuse to sit down and talk at you about historical linguistics. Anyway, I'm sure I got some facts wrong in this video, so please let me know if you notice anything. I'll put all my corrections in a pinned comment. I'm also taking suggestions for other videos I should make in this style. I'm probably going to focus on historical linguistics for now. But until then, I hope you have a great rest of your day. See y'all next time, and annyeong kaseo.